C-SPAN, created by America's cable companies 35 years ago and brought to you as a public service by your local cable or satellite provider.
And this is the Communicators on C-SPAN. This week, a discussion on the issue of the radicalization of cyberspace. Let me introduce you to our two guests. Alberto Fernandez is a former career member of the Foreign Service. He's now with the Middle East Media Research Institute. And Seamus Hughes, who spent a while at the National Counterterrorism Center, is now with George Washington University, their Extremism program. He's the deputy director there. Seamus Hughes, when you hear the phrase radicalization of cyberspace, what does that mean to you?
I think you're seeing kind of an explosion of the use of social media to recruit, particularly in America, individuals to ISIS. So their use of social media like Twitter, which was a platform of choice for a number of years, to now Telegram, where they're largely concentrated. You see these ones and twos individuals in the U.S. who aren't finding like-minded people at the mosque community centers and are reaching online to find those recruiters and radicalizers.
Mr. Fernandez, what does that term mean to you?
Well, to me, it means something maybe a little broader because, I mean, you have basically a space where a certain image and persona and reality is portrayed, which is part of the tool that is used in the radicalization process. There's a misnomer that exists in this space, and people think that some guy watches an ISIS video and automatically becomes a jihadist robot. It's actually more complicated than that. That's one element of a larger intellectual, psychological, emotional process that takes a person from being one thing to being something else. It's like anything else. Love, hate, anger, fear, it's a complicated thing. So the social media aspect is an important part of it. But I think sometimes we go from exaggerating to minimizing. We seem to go back and forth between the two.
For both of you, has it made recruiting for ISIS easier?
Yes, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it allows ISIS to portray a very powerful image of itself, which can be all things to all people. You want depth, you want religiosity, you can have that. You want bloodlust, you want revenge, you want wacko kind of ways of killing, you have that as well. So it allows them to project a complete package in a way that bypasses television, bypasses the regular media. It's accessible for all people.
And looking not only at the message, but operationally, you see ISIS using it in three different ways. The first way is grooming. So in the U.S. context, we saw over about a 6-month period, we look at ISIS English language Twitter accounts to get a sense of what the scene looked like. And what you find is you have a number of individuals who are interested about their faith, they're naive, they have questions, and there's spotters online. They're essentially grooming them into the process and answering questions in a very innocuous way, right? So it's, this is your answer for your question on religion, and then slowly they introduce kind of the ISIS ideology, the narrative into the conversation. So that's the first scope in terms of grooming. The other way they use the online environment is logistical support. I think back to a case of Muhammad Khan from Chicago. 19-year-old kid goes to O'Hare Airport with his 17-year-old and 16-year-old brother and sister. They're going to go to Syria and join ISIS. When they picked him up and arrested him for terrorism charges, they found 4 numbers of people to call when he got to Turkey to cross the border. How did he get those numbers? How does a kid from Chicago get numbers? Well, he reached out to contacts he made on Twitter. So it's logistical support. And then the last way, I think, is increasingly important is this idea of what the FBI director calls the devil on the shoulder. Individuals that are egging people on to do what they can where they are. It's getting increasingly harder to travel to Syria and Iraq. The messaging has changed a little bit in terms of joining the so-called caliphate. It's much more, do what you can where you are, and you're having a constant, essentially shaming of individuals for not acting.
Is there a naivete among the individuals who are being sucked into this?
Well, the first thing that you always say, and Seamus has said it and others have always say it, is there's no one pattern, right? You get all kinds of different people. You get people who are, more conservative. You get people who are shallow. You get gangbangers. You get converts. But given the fact that there's a lot of individuality, there is a lot of difference, yes, that you do get a kind of a large subset of people who are shallow. So, so this is an ideology projected through social media which, as I said, can be profound, but is also shallow. So it's basically an ideology on a bumper sticker or in 140 characters. So it can be it becomes almost like a label or a sticker that kind of empowers people to do things or encourages people to undertake a path in life or a type of violence in life. So yeah, it does appeal to a kind of a certain naivete.
And I've been looking at this about 10 years, right? So the old school guys about 10 years ago, they were, they had the knuckleheads, but you had also the big thinkers, right? They wanted to read that 100-page treatise and understand exactly how this stuff worked and, Dilazam and all of that stuff. These guys, for the most part, they're not interested in that type of level of granularity. That's not to say that there's not exceptions and there's not people that are drawn into it. For the most part, it's very much what Alberto said. It's that bumper sticker idea. How do I fill my worldview to make sense for what they're telling me?
And it's the spirit of the age, because we live, leaving Islamism and jihadism aside, we live in an age where people take the National Enquirer as news, or Russia Today, or Press TV, or InfoWars, or something on the internet that they see. So that this appeal to Salafi jihadist mobilization is very modern, it's very postmodern. It fits into this hyper-realistic world that we live in, where we're constantly absorbing this barrage of symbolic, shallow pictures, images, and thoughts. So it's a type of mobilization for dummies and for the people of today. It's not medieval. I hate it when people use that term about ISIS and stuff. It's not that. It's actually something very modern and very current.
It's very much a narrowcasting, right? So you're able to, just like if you're on your Facebook feed and you only look at one newscast and then it slowly necks down into only newscasts of that political bent. It's similar dynamic when you look at ISIS recruitment online. It's an echo chamber, right? You're only hearing what you want to hear. You're only looking and listening to stories of things that reinforce your already held beliefs. And so you see that play out time and time again. And dissenting voices are quickly kind of pushed to the side or blocked on Twitter or kicked out on Telegram. So there's not an ability to kind of interject your way into this conversation in a kind of ease.
So are we talking specifically about ISIS, or are there other groups out there that are using these tools?
Well, one of the big lessons learned, which has happened as a result of the astonishing success of the Islamic State, say over the last couple of years, 3 years in the social media space, is how other jihadist groups have adapted and how they've changed. One of the big learners has been what used to be called the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda in Syria, who's really upped their game. They've adopted ways of doing media, the way ISIS does media. They've adopted a certain kind of visual style. They've upped the production of what they're doing. So, the West is trying to learn. The West is trying to do better jobs of counteracting this. But other bad guys have also learned lessons from ISIS and have learned to improve the way that they do media.
And then there's lessons learned. There's also in terms of demographics, right? The average age of an ISIS recruit is 26, but in the U.S., but in 1/3 of the cases, they're 21 years or younger. These guys grew up on social media. They understand the platforms in ways that normal people that haven't grown up to this wouldn't. So they're able to learn those lessons and apply it to trying to get their message out. You're also dealing with a subset of people that are fervent in their beliefs, right? They're going to spend all their waking hours pushing this in a way that government is going to work 9 to 5 to do. So it's a very difficult dynamic to counter.
So there's a pretty high level of sophistication.
Yeah, and Alberto knows this better than anyone else in terms of production and how they disseminate the messaging. But it's not one way to do it. There's the veneer of a news organization, of ISIS news organization, but there's also kind of, again, this narrow casting of, if you are interested in utopian society and the caliphate, this is the message you're going to look at. If you're more interested in showing that ISIS is winning, this is the channel you go to check that out. So you can kind of pick and choose what you need in order to fulfill any doubts you had to begin with.
They are, their scope, their presence in social media is declining. The Islamic State, it's going down. The numbers are decreasing. In fact, they've decreased in some ways by about 2/3. But there are two problems. One is the initial footprint, or the footprint that they eventually developed in social media, say a couple of years ago, was huge. So even 1/3 of what they had before is really big. Second of all, they still have the ability, despite all the talk about what the West or the U.S. government is doing, they still have the ability to project based on an event, based on an incident, something they want to maximize. They can surge, piggybacking and using the mainstream media and using the 24-hour news cycle, kind of the way a parasite would use it. So they're smaller than they were before, but they're still pretty darn big.
What makes an effective video or an effective presentation that you've seen online?
You mean theirs or ours?
Theirs.
Oh, but it varies. It depends. I watch all of them, and I'm often I'm not a Muslim or a jihadist, but I'm often moved or horrified or intrigued by what they do. It can be all things to all people. You'll see a video that'll be about them helping poor people and giving alms to the poor, and then you have another one which is pure carnage and bloodlust, and you have your action video, your action fighting video. So they have enough volume and they have enough variety that you can pick and choose. You don't like this one, you'll like the next one. You didn't like Fast and Furious 7, maybe you'll like Fast and Furious 8. That's the way they do it.
Are these videos accessible to anybody on the internet?
Pretty much so. I mean, it's become more difficult to see them than it was a couple of years ago. In 2014, these guys had free reign in social media. They had kind of mature, long-term presence that was not obstructed. This is one of the challenges that I had when we were in government, is that nobody was taking them down in 2014. Slowly that began to change. So it's more difficult to see their stuff today, but not that difficult.
It's actually, that evolution is going to be interesting too. So when the first advent of kind of terrorist use of the internet was about a dozen or so password protected forums. You kind of had to know somebody to get in. You get there and you were a fervent believer to begin with, right? You had already bought into the ideology. Then an evolution over to social media, which allowed you to expand out your messaging on Twitter, to get the fence sitters, if you will, and be able to project a larger strength. Now with the removal of content on Twitter, or at least the enforcing of terms of service in kind of a more structured way, you're seeing them move to Telegram, which is a mixture actually between the old and the new, the password protected and the Twitter social media. So you can get on channels, but you have to know which channels to go to. And what that means for recruitment and radicalization, I think the jury's still out on that. Are they still going to be as viable in terms of recruitment? At the program, we try to interview these individuals online. It's very hard to figure out who's a recruiter and who's not, right? But they're not as naive or trusting as they were before. Meaning that if I had reached out to an ISIS recruiter a year ago and said, I'm Seamus Hughes, I'm from the program on Extremism at George Washington, I want to interview you, I would likely get a response, and we'd have a back and forth about it, right? Now it's less so. They're less trusting of it. They think, people that are reaching out are either law enforcement or journalists or some other ill, and they don't see the benefit of talking to other individuals, which means they also don't see the benefit of talking to some guy in Indiana who reaches out and says, I want to go join ISIS. They're less likely to trust that guy. It takes a while for vetting.
But, it is changing. It used to be, for example, that, as Seamus said, Twitter was the site for them. They moved to Telegram, but we see it. We've documented it at Memory. They've done this, they did this last week. They constantly encourage people, go back to Twitter. Mm-hmm. Don't abandon Twitter. They see Twitter and they were the pioneers. I mean, other terrorist groups used Twitter before. Al-Shabaab, Hamas, Hezbollah all used Twitter. But Twitter was the medium used for the Islamic State.
Why is that?
Basically because of its broad brush appeal. It's both shallow and broad, right? Because of the kind of interlocking network. It's really easy to get kind of a broad, diffuse ecosystem that they developed to get their message out. So they still long for the golden days of 2014 when they were unobstructed, and they still long for kind of the ability that Twitter gave them to get their message out. At Telegram, they describe it as a safe haven. Mm-hmm. They say, thank goodness that Telegram doesn't throw us off completely. Telegram occasionally throws them off, but not like Twitter has done. So they're always looking for the next useful platform. There's another thing that's changing, of course, which is the nature of the Islamic State. This is the big question mark. What happens when the physical caliphate is destroyed? Now, ISIS is not going to disappear tomorrow or next year or 2 years from now. But you do see trends on the ground of kind of the heartland, the ISIS heartland is under tremendous stress. How is the message going to adapt to deal with the fall of Mosul and the fall of Raqqa? That's the big question mark. And how will that affect their presence in social media and their ability to recruit people, to join them, to move there? How do you move to a place if there's no place to move to, right?
Absolutely. And the conversation about Twitter, I think, is still very important. You're absolutely right. They've been talking about that. They also surge up, as you mentioned. They surge up after an attack. So while they weren't on Twitter after the attack in France, everybody jumps back on Twitter and talks about it and gets in. There's also, I think, an understudied look at the resiliency built into the system. So, for example, on Twitter, they have accounts, shout-out accounts. When we were watching last summer, we watched an individual called Lone Wolf 7. This individual got arrested for terrorism charges a few months later. But when we watched him, he was Lone Wolf 7 on Twitter. When he got kicked off, he was Lone Wolf 8, 9, 10, 11. Until he got arrested, he was Lone Wolf 21. Every single time he got kicked off, there's shout-out accounts that announce his new arrival. They say, hey, brothers and sisters, this was Lone Wolf 7. He's now Lone Wolf 8. Everyone follow Lone Wolf 8. Now, they're never going to have the same number of followers they had before, but there is resiliency built in the system. And there's dummy accounts, and they trade accounts to be able to make sure that if Alberto can't get on, then he can use this guy's account, or vice versa. So they're trying to adapt to this new environment.
One of the fascinating things they do when they release a video, for example, on Telegram, is at the bottom of it, they list all the different places where you can find it. And yeah, you have Twitter, YouTube, the ones that you and I know, but then they have all these exotic triple, quadruple, quintuple places they put it, all kinds of different venues where it can be there so they can be propagated and get into kind of the bloodstream.
What is Telegram?
It's kind of an end-to-end, and then I'll let Alberto jump in because Memory's done amazing work on this, but it's essentially an end-to-end encryption. Think of it like a text messaging application, but the ability to do it in a group text way. So all three of us can go down on a chat, and then I can push out a text to everybody, and you all follow it. And again, it's a very permissive environment for these for ISIS supporters. They tend not to go down very much. They have backup accounts, which they constantly repeat to everybody and say, make sure you follow these backup accounts. And sometimes they send out the backup accounts before an attack or a major release because they know they're going to get kicked off. So they want to be able to have, again, that resiliency or redundancy in the system.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's an app, social media application that was set up by the guy who's known as often called the Mark Zuckerberg of Russia, Pavel Durov. Supposedly the company is based in Berlin, Germany.
Supposedly.
Well, I mean, I have no reason to doubt that, but, I don't want to accuse Germany for, trust but verify that it's actually there. But it's a European company, and it has some of the features of the old password protected sites and some of the features of Twitter, but not the ease of use. You have to know what you're looking for. You don't have the ability of hashtags, for example, finding things very easily as you do with Twitter. So it's a useful place for them. And we in Memory, we documented that last year how they basically in 2015 they were driven from Twitter and they found safe haven in Telegram. Another platform which they frequently use is Just Paste It, which is basically just you put pictures. You also put links to things as well. And, of course, archives.org, which is a U.S.-based internet archives.org based in California. Now, all three of these entities there's a lot of terrorist material on these entities. But even there, things have become more difficult for ISIS and jihadists than maybe a year ago. That's a good thing. So it's easy to beat up on social media companies, and I know we do frequently, but there has been progress if you compare it to where we were a year ago or 2 years ago.
I want to show some video and get your reaction. You'll recognize what this is.
We cannot allow the internet to be used as a recruiting tool and for other purposes by our enemy. We must shut down their access to this form of communication, and we must do it immediately. Immediately.
Seamus Hughes.
So at the program we talk a lot about religion, so I try to avoid politics. But in terms of the idea of what he's advocating for, we look at these type of things. There again, the redundancy in the system actually matters great deal. That's not to say takedown of content isn't important. It clearly affected the network when Twitter essentially stepped up to the plate and decided to take down content. But it's not the be-all, end-all. You're never going to get a silver bullet when it comes to social media recruitment or radicalization or try to countering that. It's much more, okay, so how do you take down content? How do you push counter and alternative messaging? How do you introduce seeds of doubt so that you can do in-person interventions because you're never really going to be able to de-radicalize someone online? And how do you put all those things together? And how do you get social media companies who, by their very nature, are libertarian, right? If given the option, it's a free and open society online, and they've essentially been forced into this position of takedown. So we need to give them another alternative in terms of, how do you connect? I think back to my old job in government. I used to be a community engagement officer on these issues. So I was in Sacramento about 2 years ago, and an imam of the mosque raised his hand and said, Seamus, I want to do counter messaging. And I said, well, what do you want to do? He's like, I'm going to tape a video of myself, and I'm going to put it on YouTube. I said, sir, that's great. No one's going to watch it. It's going to be 45 minutes long. You're not going to know how to tag it, and you're not going to hit your target audience. But as a role of government, you can play an important power for convening, right? So I have the ability in government to call the guy in Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and say, I got a guy in Sacramento who really wants to do something. He's got a good message, but he has no idea how to use your platform. Can you help that out, right? Again, those type of things are not going to be the only solution when it comes to countering this stuff, but you can't just pick one silver bullet.
Yeah, one of the great myths in government, whether it's a bipartisan myth, is that there's some kind of magic pixie dust or silver bullet that'll make the jihadists go away. That there's a button you push in social media and they'll disappear. It doesn't work that way. However, number one, as Seamus said, taking stuff down, even if they come back, is useful. It shrinks their footprint, makes life more difficult for them. There's a lot more that we could do. One test that I did recently when I testified before the Senate was I picked certain terms which ISIS and other groups use in their propaganda, kind of terms from Islam that they use frequently. And I put it in, for example, on YouTube to see, surprise, what would be the first result that I would get back? In almost every case, the result I got back was of extremists explaining a term. So you have a term, say, like kufr, unbelief, which is a very important term. And you didn't get some, liberal or tolerant guy talking about, well, unbelief, it depends. No, you got an extremist. So there are algorithms, there are ways that you can game the system to make life a little more difficult to them. But there are no quick fixes. We love in America, and politicians especially love, kind of make these broad, sweeping statements. As I said, this is both Democrats and Republicans do this. It's not that easy to fix. If it was, people would have done it years ago.
And there's also the importance of the actual physical caliphate. And we'll see how as it shrinks, but it's not like if Twitter and Facebook went away tomorrow, you wouldn't have 30,000 people traveling to Syria and Iraq. There is something drawing them. There's a perceived religious obligation. That's an important dynamic that I think we don't look at. We focus entirely kind of on this idea of social media as the end-all, be-all. And there's important dynamics there, but there's other things in play.
Yeah, we often, people like to beat up on social media companies. These are vehicles reflecting a reality. It may be a skewed reality, it may be a manufactured reality. But what gave ISIS its power was not that it used Twitter. What gave ISIS its power is that it miraculously took the second largest city in Iraq and then a huge part of Iraq and Syria, seemingly like that. That's what gives it its power. The idea of the caliphate, all the package involved in that word and the history of it. So social media is a vehicle for that stuff. But the content is not so, it's not content unique to social media. It's content related to the real world.
Is there an ick factor in censoring these people?
What do you mean?
We're talking about censorship. We're talking about taking sites down. We're talking about Twitter deciding what is appropriate and what is not. Is there a hesitation about that?
Well, there is a default, as Shana said, there's a default position often in Silicon Valley and social media companies, which is a kind of libertarian worldview. You're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom. So that's the default mindset that a lot of people have. But, you know, governments and societies always decide certain things are beyond the pale, you know, whether it be child pornography or other things or incitement to violence. Not every country is the same. You have democratic countries, for example, in Western Europe, that have much stricter rules than we do. We have our First Amendment. We have a different way of looking at it. But I don't think there's any problem in kind of trying to make life more difficult for the extremists, realizing that we live in a democratic, open society and there's always going to be a risk. There are always going to be intolerant people or unpleasant people using the media, using social media. But there are ways to mitigate that at the same time respecting our laws and traditions.
And a lot of this actually plays to it's an easier solution, meaning that it's easier to take down content and ask for content to be taken down if you're a congressional official. Say, you know, why is ISIS using your platform? And that's an easy solution, right? It's hard to do counter messaging and alternative messaging. It's hard to craft a message. It takes the right people. It takes the right resources. It takes the right targeting. That takes time and effort, and not a whole lot of return on investment. So if you release, you know, if you try and do some trial and error online, some things work and some things don't. The things that don't work, do you have the political cover to be able to do that, right? Are people going to back your play? You know, if you look at the last couple of years, maybe not, right? This is the issue, and this is why I think we default to this idea of takedown, is because the other stuff's really, really hard.
Finally, gentlemen, what further effort would you like to see made by the federal government or by the Congress to combat this social media?
I think, at least in the U.S. context, there's not enough done in terms of intervention space. So in many ways, the online persona is essentially a reflection of the offline life. So these individuals, while they're fervent in their beliefs online, they're also fervent in their beliefs offline. And there's no off-ramps, there's no intervention programs. So if I'm a parent of a 18-year-old kid I'm worried about, I have no option. There's not a list of people to call, there's not a hotline, there's nothing I can do other than watch a train wreck happen in slow motion, hope it's a phase, or potentially watch my loved one be arrested. And until we provide those type of different avenues, you're going to continue to have these individuals and these parents who are essentially hopeless in this scenario. And the best bet they have is unplug the internet, which isn't an acceptable answer for this.
Yeah, you need both, building on that, both on and off ramps, right? You need you need the ability to help people get off that that path where they're being led to violent extremism. And you also need to ramp up the ability to utilize the reality of people, the stories, the testimony, the personal life, personal history of broken lives of people who were in that. It's still underutilized. We have hundreds of people in the West returning from Syria, from the Islamic State. Only a small part of their testimony, a small part of their own personal history has been captured. There are a few organizations, there's a good NGO that started last year that works on this area of recanters and defectors, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Alberto Fernandez is the Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute, and Seamus Hughes is Deputy Director of the Extremism Program at George Washington University's Center